Now I'm going to turn to Scottish politics. I managed to upset my SNP fans a couple of weeks ago, and I don't mean that in a patronising or a facetious way. I didn't fully appreciate the historical context of Lindsay Hoyle's decision to accept the Labour amendment for a vote in the House of Commons as opposed to the SNP's original motion. It looked to me like a hissy fit. You schooled me. I was wrong. I'm grateful for that education. I really am. And conscious of needing still to have a much deeper understanding of the history of Scottish politics, Scottish nationalism, really, in particular. The deputy leader of the SNP, this is really interesting, but it is one of those topics, they don't come up very often. It's one of those topics where you're going to know a hell of a lot more than I do. And when I say they don't come up very often, I mean the ones that are about politics and opinions rather than the ones that are about experiences. If we're doing a phone-in based on experiences, particularly experiences that I won't have because I'm a bloke or because I'm white or because I'm not skinned or whatever it might be, then obviously you know a hell of a lot more about it than I do. We talk about being on the receiving end of misogyny. You know a hell of a lot more about it than I do. So this is about political opinions. And crucially on the programme, it's about understanding the opinion. So I don't just want to know what you think, I want to know why you think it. Because Keith Brown, who is the deputy leader of the SNP, has referred to that episode I just mentioned, the treatment of his party over that Gaza ceasefire debate. And if there were proof needed of the seriousness of that episode, the seriousness that I failed to appreciate, but I'm not going to start self-flagellating or dress in sackcloth and ashes. I've said sorry, I've admitted I got it horribly wrong, and I've moved on. But if you need proof of how serious it is for SNP members and supporters, then know this. The deputy leader of the SNP has said it's time to think about pulling our MPs out of Westminster altogether. He wants a debate on the case for withdrawing its MPs from Westminster. And again, I hesitate to offer up pungent opinions because my last one was so wrong. But this is clearly a very big deal, potentially, a very, very big deal. He wants this debate following what he describes as those shambolic events in Parliament where the SNP were deprived of a vote and indeed also deprived of a later debate over a ceasefire in Gaza. It was like a double whammy when Lindsay Hoyle broke convention in the Commons by allowing that amendment to be brought forward. And then, well, hopes or promises that another debate would be held were then failed to materialise. He told a Scottish newspaper that tradition whereby Westminster sidelines, marginalises or suppresses Scotland is not new. A deft conflation there of the SNP with the whole of Scotland, but in a sense that's what nationalism does, isn't it? And that's what nationalism is all about. And by nationalism I mean independence, not the kind of nationalism that leads in the other direction, a belief that you are somehow superior to somebody else because of where you were born. He also added, given the diet democracy of the UK, by which he means sort of democracy light, and the denial of democracy to Scotland, it seems we now need to examine whether it is right to confer any legitimacy on an institution determined to deny democracy in Scotland. So, the deputy leader of the SNP is suggesting that the SNP, currently the third largest party in the House of Commons, withdraw its members from that place. The precedent for it, as you probably already know, would be Sinn Féin, who refused to sit in the House of Commons despite having been democratically elected to it because they were dedicated to a united Ireland. I have no clue on this. I don't generally like starting phone-ins with an admission of complete ignorance, partly because I should know more than I do usually, but on this occasion I'm going to give myself a break because I don't think that you can have a particularly strong opinion on this unless you are particularly passionate about Scottish independence in particular and Scottish domestic politics in general. So here are the questions I would like you to answer, okay? Here are the questions I would like you to answer. I mean, the most obvious one is do you think this is a good idea? Would you like to see the SNP withdraw its MPs from Westminster? I think you need to be in the game to have an opinion that's interesting on that. You need to be Scottish and heavily invested from one side or the other in the independence question. Because the second question I will ask you, if you do ring in, is this. Would this help or hinder the independence cause? In your opinion, Ken Brown obviously believes that it would massively help the independence cause. Keith Brown obviously believes on some level that it would massively help the independence cause. I don't completely see why. We would talk a lot less about the SNP if Stephen Flynn wasn't the second leader to get up at PMQs every Wednesday and usually score some palpable hits on both the Prime Minister and the leader of the Labour Party. But that's me being Westminster-centric. Maybe that has no bearing at all on moving the needle for the next Scottish independence referendum, whenever that may be. But what would it mean? What would it mean, not just for Scottish politics, but for British politics as well, if the SNP were not sitting in the House of Commons? All right? I want to try, he says vainly, I want to try to avoid having a different phone-in. I phone in about Scottish independence. I don't want to have a phone-in about Scottish independence today because I want to have a phone-in about the prospect of the SNP pulling its MPs out of Westminster. I want to know whether you want to see that and why, and I want to know what it would do to the prospects, the hopes, the dreams of Scottish independence and or British politics in general. Because I'll tell you what my feeling is. Every time I tell you why, as an English person, I am not a passionate pro-independence advocate for Scotland. You accuse me of just wanting Scotland to stay part of the United Kingdom because I have some nice holidays there. I've never said that. Listen, do what I do for a living. You're going to get misrepresented left, right and centre. It is my emotional response to the question. I'm pretty sure now that if I was Scottish, I'd be pro-independence. But I'm not, and I don't want to see my country break up. That's all, and I don't want to have that argument today either. I'm just explaining that that's where I come from, and I think that I have a sort of similar feeling with regard to the SNP leaving Westminster. I think Westminster would be the poorer for not having the SNP there, particularly oddly in the last year or so when Stephen Flynn's done such a bang-up job in the chamber. So I don't think that matters and I don't think it counts, but I think it's important to tell you where I'm coming from. So the reason why I am loosely supportive of the union is because I'm in it and I want it to stay like it was before. And the reason why I am cautiously supportive or cautiously opposed to the idea of the SNP taking its members out of Westminster is because I think Westminster would lose as a consequence of that decision. Although if I was a Scottish independence supporter, of course, I couldn't care less about that. So that's enough of my views. Tell me yours. 0345 6060 973. And is there a possibility, while I fully acknowledge the significance and the importance and the historical context of what Lindsay Hoyle did to the SNP a couple of weeks ago, would this be an overreaction on the part of the party and look a bit like, to outsiders, taking your ball home because you didn't get the result that you wanted? SNP thinking of pulling their MPs out of Westminster, or at least their deputy leader says it's time to think about doing that. Just explain it to me, and obviously do so through the lens of whether you think it's a good idea or not. Let's start with Liz, who's in Strathpeffer. Liz, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello.
Hiya. So if you'd asked me this a few years ago, I probably would have said, and I am an SNP member, I'm an elected member in the local council, I would have said, no, we need them there. And the reason for that is my family are European, we're international. These matters are all reserved. We had no voice over that in Holyrood. Ian Blackford was my MP, and I was so grateful that he stood up time and time again and spoke in my behalf. But then I watched him, and I watched him being laughed at. I watched him being ridiculed.
That was largely during Boris Johnson's period of leadership. I appreciate it didn't begin and end with that, but I think Parliament went to a fairly low place for obvious reasons during that period, from which it can return, Liz, is all I'm saying.
I don't have any faith in Westminster. I think they are now using the Westminster powers to overrule decisions we made in Scotland. We passed the GRR here, cross-party.
Yeah.
We passed legislation to recycle, plastics. Now, the only reason that was passed because we couldn't possibly do it in Scotland, and that, if they hadn't done it in England, there was no other reason for that. We've now got shops here that have the machines put in to recycle that are not being used.
I didn't know this.
Yeah. So there was that. We also passed. We wanted to incorporate the rights of the child into Scottish law, and we couldn't do that because if we did that, it would make the two-child cap, which is mitigated in Scotland, but it would make it illegal if we passed it into law because you couldn't say one child's got more rights than another. So we've had to go back. Emma Roddick, who is our Minister for Equalities, had to go back and look at that, and we had to do huge mitigations to pass the rights of children into Scottish law because Westminster stopped it. And I've just had enough, James.
You explained it incredibly well. Before we get on to last week, just to be clear, but I understand you properly, in the context of devolution and or independence, legislatively speaking or logistically speaking, you see no point in having MPs in Westminster, full stop.
Not anymore.
No,
not
okay,
now.
I get that.
For a long time,
I get that. Now on to next week. On to last week. What happened and why that changed things for you?
It was just the last straw. It was opposition day. We know that Westminster is set up for binary parties. We know that because it's first past the post, smaller parties have no voice. We know that in Westminster. So we in Scotland have to sit and wait. If England votes Labour, we've had Labour in the past, but we're too small. We've got less now because we'd have moved two of our constituencies, 8 of Wales, and England have got an additional 10. So it's a numbers game.
So what do you lose by not being there? And I know you don't think you need to be there anymore, but is there anything that you might lose? Because I won't talk about... I don't talk about Scottish politics enough, arguably, but without the weekly reminder of the SNP and the parliamentary quality that Stephen Flynn in particular now provides, I think you're going to beep even less on our radar. But that, of course, may not matter at all. We may do, but has that mattered? Has that changed anything? We just got told we're grievance mongering. And I think the thing that I worried that we might lose is I also work part-time for an MSP, so a member of the Scottish Parliament, and I work very closely with the local MP, who is Ian Blackford. Now, that is non-political, it's casework. So when people come to us, and they might come about, if they come about the NHS, or they come about schools, they come about devolved matters, about justice, the MSPs have fast tracks into all these public bodies and they can take up cases for people. When it comes to reserved matters, so the post office, defence, immigration is the big one, it is the MPs that take that forward. Now, they can still do that, whether they're sitting in Westminster or not. What they did in Westminster was... It was a show, it was the visual thing that they're there, and it did mean a lot to me during Brexit because it ripped my whole family apart, pulled the ground out from underneath me. And it was good to have that voice, these voices. So it's not binary. You can see some downsides to it, but they're not big enough to overshadow the plus sides. What do you say to the observation that you're essentially calling for the SNP not to be in the Parliament that makes decisions on reserved matters? It seems a bit self-defeating.
Our vote doesn't count anyway. Our vote, we've only got, even if every single Scottish constituency voted SNP, are we 57 seats now in a parliament of over 600?
But as a progressive party, in alliance with other progressive parties on reserved matters, you may get your way. But if you're not there, it becomes considerably less likely.
I don't see anywhere where we've got our way.
No,
I don't really see anywhere where
answer.
it's made a difference. I don't, I think it's... The only thing that I felt made a big difference was following Theresa May's hostile immigration thing. Now, I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but I had an immigration issue with my family, and it was very difficult, to talk about it. And it was only when we got the 56 MPs that they stood up, and one after another they talked about very similar issues that I've had.
So you focus the attention of Westminster on a Scottish matter by dint of being in Westminster. I'm not hurrying you. I'm just conscious of a lot of other people who want to contribute to this conversation, and that is quite a big deal, but not big enough. To be absolutely clear, I'm fully conscious of the fact that the independence movement lost the last referendum. Please don't think for a minute I'm confining this conversation to Scottish people in favour of independence or committed to it. But I don't know what... I mean, and ring me and tell me what you think about the prospect of SNP MPs leaving Westminster. As someone who wants the union to sustain, do you think that is good or bad for your cause? Perfectly possible you think this is great news for unionists because it means that the voices of nationalists will be quietened on the... I can't say the national stage. I always say my country when I mean the United Kingdom, or I don't. Obviously, in the context of Scottish politics, it sounds like I mean England, but I don't. I don't want my what country, nation, country, whatever. I don't want the United. Anyway, you want it to stay together, and therefore you have a view on what SNP MPs leaving Westminster might mean. Tony's in Greenock. Tony, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. I caveat with what's just been said by your previous caller. I would agree with most of what she says, but where I would disagree is to say that I think there's value in the MPs staying where they are. And albeit they might not get listened to, albeit they might get ridiculed and they might get,
just on that, briefly,
yeah.
Doesn't everyone get ridiculed in the House of Commons?
Yeah, well, everyone does, but I think the point I'm trying to make, that it helps the sense of grievance that the SNP needs to have to say, look how bad it is down here. Look how we are treated by our English neighbours.
This is 3D chess, isn't it, Tony?
Yeah,
this is the 3D chess reading of the situation.
But because I think if they take that away, the fact that they're left with how they're doing locally in Scotland as a governing party. And to be honest with you, for a lot of people, including myself, in many areas, the jury is out on that. They've done a lot of good things. There are a lot of good things. Free prescriptions. There's a lot of childcare things that we get up here that aren't available nationwide. But talking to friends, education, people in education, very disappointed with the SNP. So if they fight locally on how they've done as a government in Scotland, I don't think the support would be there. But what I think they need is that the representatives down in Parliament to say, well, look, here's the alternative. You stay with this crowd. They don't give a F about us.
Because I'm imagining myself being in the constituency you describe, and I would be completely susceptible to this. Oh, look, they're not doing a great job on this, that, or the other, but look at the way they treat us down in Westminster. Yeah. I'm indie till I die. Completely works. That's how do you know what you've done? I said 3D chess. It was a bit patronising. You've gone human rather than political, haven't you? You've gone pure human.
The first person to say that to me for a while.
But it's true, though, isn't it? It's like I'm trying to persuade you to vote for independence. You're saying, look at the state of my kid's school, and I'm saying, well, look at how they treat us down in Westminster. Why do you want? What is it the Proclaimers sang? You know, I won't understand why you let someone else rule your land cap in hand, and that's what it looks like when you point at the way that
it comes from the table, really.
Yes.
And I kind of play a long game with this to think, independence might be the short-term goal, but long-term, the SNP might not be the party that governs the country.
True.
Yeah, no, it will not be a one-party state because Labour, the Tories and Liberals, they'll all be there in some form or another. Whether, and
there'll be a massive recalibration as well of Scottish politics, and you'll have movements, as you say, coming from quite long and rich traditions of both Scottish and British politics, having to recalibrate and rejig and coming back into the political fray completely. I'm using a lot of re's in this analysis, but completely refreshed. Thank you, Tony. That's really strong. I try that one on for size. And speaking of 3D chess and politics, I'm looking at the latest polls, which have Labour 27 points ahead. Emoji sarcasm, hashtag quotes, fingers, all right? Any other leader would be 30 points ahead, wouldn't they? Hey? Do you see what I did there? I'm joking. And the Tories are on 20%. But thinking of the argument that the poll lead might cause apathy and not be good for Labour, I'm going to explain to you in a minute why, in the course of the last 15 minutes, I've begun to think that the opposite might be true. I'm going to read you something. I found it amazingly, because I remember needing to read this at the time, and I'm going back now to 2018, almost to the day, actually, March 2018. The 6th of March 2018, it really is almost to the day. But it was when some of us thought that Sinn Féin might move in and undermine Theresa May's relatively tiny majority when she was sowing the seeds for the disasters of Brexit, some of which were avoidable, although they became completely unavoidable when she did her red lines and committed herself also to the abolition of freedom of movement. But a Sinn Féin MP, Paul Maskey, wrote a great piece back then, 6 years ago, under the headline, "This is why I won't go to Westminster, even over Brexit." And I think it gives food for thought to Scottish nationalists like our first caller, Liz, who support Keith Brown's suggestion that it's time to think about withdrawing your MPs from Westminster. Listen to this. To the British public, it may seem strange to stand for election to an institution and then refuse to participate in that institution. For British citizens with a progressive worldview and those with an anti-Brexit disposition, it might appear logical to take these seats. And for British MPs, that is entirely logical because the Westminster Parliament is the democratic institution that makes decisions on behalf of the British people. And then he reminds us that, of course, the history of Sinn Féin's refusal to partake in Westminster politics is because of their commitment to Irish republicanism. They're not going to abandon the Irish Republican principle of abstentionism in any circumstances whatsoever, because it is a raison d'etre for the entire Sinn Féin party. But it doesn't apply to the SNP, does it? My parallel was, I think, justified but clumsy, because the Westminster Parliament is the democratic institution that makes decisions on behalf of the British people. So why would you not be in it to help make those decisions to the benefit of the people you represent? James is in Glasgow. James, what do you reckon?
Hi, good morning, James.
Hello.
It's a pleasure to speak to you, Paul. I think you're
Likewise.
a different classmate.
You're very kind. Thank you.
Just regarding what the SNP, I'm an SNP voter myself, but only after 2014 I became an SNP voter. I've been Labour all my life. I just feel as if we've maybe jumped the gun by saying this. I think we should maybe wait until we can get as much MPs as possible in the next general election, which, God willing, will be maybe the middle of the year, but I think it'll be the end of the year.
Yeah, same.
Try and get as much MPs as possible in, and then we can maybe make that step, get into, God willing, the next year.
Good chicken and egg, though, isn't it? Because I think you're probably more vulnerable in terms of numbers in this year's election than you were in 2019, certainly, or 2017. The Labour Party has made enormous strides in Scotland since Keir Starmer became leader. Just looking at polls, and you know what polls...
You're right, James, they have, but I think Labour's more made strides in the local elections and with our local parliament, with Scottish Parliament, forgive me, and local council elections. I think when it comes to the big election, I think that's when the people who have voted Labour in their local elections will turn back to the SNP because they see how the SNP is treated. I listen to yourself all the time, but I listen to Prime Minister's questions, and any time a Scottish politician talks, it's like carnage within Parliament, and it's horrible to listen to. And I get it, everybody gets the kind of same treatment, but it feels as if we get it worse. I just feel as if we're not respected for how we're speaking. And understand my accent's very strong. Even our local MP, David Linden, there was one time he was speaking in Parliament and he was asked to repeat what he said 3 or 4 times by a Conservative politician. And I think the guy was just actually trying to take...
Doing it on purpose.
I really do, James. And I feel we don't feel as if we're getting... I would love to hold my government to account. And no matter how Scotland votes, and I know, that's a different conversation, but no matter how Scotland votes, we never get to hold the government we voted to account. Look, we always voted Labour since I think it was 1957.
Yeah.
We voted Labour, and then we started voting SNP. We just want a proper voice, and we're just not getting respect.
So what you've done here, I think perfectly, is demarcate the distinction between grievance and tactic, because the grievance seems to me to be fair and very well explained by you and by other callers. But you haven't sold me the tactic. This might make you feel better, or it might seem like a just response to the unfair treatment that SNP MPs get in Westminster, whether it's the behaviour of the idiot you describe, demanding that your MP repeat himself countless times, or whether it is the disrespect shown to the SNP by Lindsay Hoyle. All of that can be true, but it still doesn't make withdrawing a good idea if you're prioritising, for example, independence above all else.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think the better idea is to try and send as
many back as possible.
Over.
Yes.
If you can send over 40 again down to Westminster, I think then you can go, right, if there's any of this again, we're just pulling them out.
But why would they? Why? I mean, who wouldn't want that, though? Do you see what I mean? It's like you'd make a threat, and the worst thing that can happen when you make a threat, it's like when your little one says, yeah, well, exactly. When your little one says they're going to run away, and you say, "Oh, I'll go and pack a bag for you," and all of the wind disappears from their sails, doesn't it?
What happens now? Yeah, you're right.
But we may find out. Who knows? We may find out. It's an interesting intervention, though, and for me at least, an unexpected one. Thank you, James. Thomas is in Fife. Thomas, what would you like to say?
I don't believe, James, that the SNP MPs should be withdrawn from Westminster. British politics has moved ever further to the right, and the SNP are on the left of that line. It would be a bad idea for Scotland if they withdrew, because then Westminster would be able to trample all over the devolution settlement, and we would have policies imposed upon us without being able to offer any meaningful opposition to them. The other thing I think about withdrawing MPs that's bad from a UK perspective is because the SNP are on the left, those people who feel disenfranchised down south will not be aware of what could happen in a more fairly governed society.
Yes.
Whilst, take for instance our NHS, it's far from ideal.
Sure.
However, reports have shown, many reports have shown that it outperforms the NHS in other parts of the UK. The SNP's childcare policy, the additional childcare payment, has lifted more children out of poverty as a proportion of the population.
You're campaigning, Thomas. This is not relevant at all to the question of whether or not the MP should leave Westminster. If
they withdraw from Westminster, then people south of the border who do not benefit from services such as these will not be made aware of them and will not be able to lobby their
for
MP,
similar
their
treatment.
elected.
I don't know if that's true. I don't know if I agree with you. So I mean, it's a good point, but I don't know why I, for example, would be prevented from saying to a Westminster politician, well, it works in Scotland. Also, strikes and industrial action, we don't do it enough, do we? We don't often enough say, when they start talking about England and Wales, we should remind them more often, well, they've come to an arrangement in Scotland, they've come to a settlement in Scotland, why can't you? I don't know that having SNP MPs in Westminster makes that more or less effective or likely.
Well, when you consider the treatment of politics in the UK through the mainstream media, the SNP in Scottish politics are predominantly viewed negatively. You know, and it's this thing about where would you be without, the block grant, with the grievance thing. I don't believe the SNP should be playing on the grievance. I think they should celebrate it, because that highlights...
And use Westminster to remind voters what Scottish people have that English and Welsh voters don't have. But should have. This is the great conundrum, isn't it, though, of progressive politics in Westminster, and it's something Stephen Flynn has driven home, I think, more effectively than anyone in the SNP in my lifetime, whether they've been based in Holyrood or Westminster or neither, and that is that, of course, the Labour Party is his enemy, at least as much as the Tory party is. And so, you're right, it would be effectively saying to Labour supporters, why haven't you got what we've had? But it wouldn't be coming from a position of alliance or allegiance. It would still be coming from a position of enmity, whereas if you're not there, you're not coming from any position at all. Thank you, Thomas. I don't know now. I think the consensus leans towards there's not a lot to be gained from leaving, except, and I'm going to choose my words quite carefully, more carefully than I usually do, but except a very valid and comprehensible sense that eventually you've got to do something to register your disgust at the way that you're treated. But as we touched upon, the danger is that you end up being a bit, I don't want to say taking your ball home, but you do make a threat that the person you're threatening is not that fussed by, in which case what on earth is achieved?